Well, good afternoon if you are in the eastern or central United States. Good morning in the western United States, Hawaii. I'm going in the other direction this time. Good early morning in Australia and Japan. Hello in the middle of the night in Central Asia. Greetings in Russia, in Greece, in Turkey, in Western Europe, especially Berlin, where my wonderful Eric is engineering this, in the UK, Portugal, Ireland, wherever you are, greetings. I'm Fred Plotkin, so this must be Fred Plotkin on Fridays, where I speak with inspiring guests. That's the word I use. And few people are more inspiring to me and have been for decades than my guest today. She gets an adjective, the delicious Lynne Rossetto Kasper. People in America and Italy know her very well, not in the music world, but in the food world. She is sort of a pasta diva, and she is the author of a book that is so well regarded and so famous and such a classic, The Splendid Table, Recipes from Emilia-Romagna, the Heartland of Northern Italian Food, written in 1992, that people often forget that she's done all kinds of other things. And we're going to talk about Emilia-Romagna today, but also about other things. Lynne is joining us from St. Paul, Minnesota in the central United States. And one more thing about Lynne before she speaks. She's the only person I've ever known who has had a tomato named for her. So what is the story of having a tomato named for you, or tomato for the UK?
Oh, this was one of the highlights of my life, Fred. I am insane for tomatoes. And for up until 2017 or 16, I did a radio show on public radio all over the United States and probably was heard. I know we had a lot of international exposure as well. It's called The Splendid Table. It's still going strong with a wonderful host, Francis Lamb. And it was very clear to my audience that I was obsessed by tomatoes. Every summer, we had to do an entire show on the tomato, from the science background and all the latest research to all the storytelling and the history. And so what we would do is we would talk tomatoes. And we got an email from a young botanist who, since he was 9 years old, had been doing crossbreeding, creating new types of different vegetables and flowers. And he was a great fan of the show, and he decided he had been doing a project for about 3 or 4 years. And the product of it was going to be called the LRK, or the Lynne Rossetto Kasper tomato. He sent samples of the experiment, blind sampling, which I did on the air. They were all very small tomatoes. And I chose the one I liked best. And that is the LRK tomato. You cannot buy it in your local seed shop, but it was great fun. And it's one of the one of the great honors in my life, because this is one of the most extraordinary fruits that has ever come down the pike from Mother Nature. So that's the story behind the tomato.
You are native to New Jersey. And in America, yeah, people have associations for many things, but I, who live in New York, one of the things that we think of and we look forward to every August and early September is the New Jersey tomato.
Right.
Did you grow up on New Jersey tomatoes? And
I absolutely did.
Tell us what makes a New Jersey tomato.
I mean, we grew tomatoes.
Yeah.
I mean, oh yeah. And when people talk about, well, today what's wonderful is what's happening in America now, and I think it's been going on, I think, in other parts of the world for a bit longer, is the rediscovery of heirloom tomatoes. The tomatoes that didn't quite make the grade commercially, meaning that they didn't remain as hard as a rock for 6 months, no matter what you did to them. And they didn't taste like styrofoam. These were the tomatoes when tomatoes had flavor. And they've made a great comeback. And we do tomato tastings all the time. And different colored tomatoes taste differently. The tomato tastes differently depending on where it's grown, but the strain of the tomato is such a big difference. And what's come to the fore, which I'm excited about, is Americans are discovering the black or purple tomatoes. And their taste profile is like a rich, deep burgundy that you're sipping with the best steak you could possibly imagine.
Mhm.
It's probably been aged about 6 weeks. So that's, yeah, I have a little bit to say about tomatoes. But, and by the way, the tomato that I think most of us were eating, New York and New Jersey, was a tomato that my husband's cousin, who attended Rutgers University, a university in New Jersey, helped develop for the Campbell soup people.
Ah,
And it's
Campbell's being in New Jersey.
yes, it's the Rutgers tomato.
Huh?
And this was a very long time ago.
Yeah.
And it's occasionally you run across it, and it's a delicious tomato.
So Lynn and I have a beloved mutual friend named Cara da Silva, food historian. You want to read her book, in Memory's Kitchen. And what you probably don't know, Lynn, is that Cara and I met at a tomato tasting. It just came to my mind. That's where we met. Yeah, a long time ago, we met at a
How
tomato.
appropriate.
Anyway, Adagio is primarily a music service, so a lot of what we're going to focus on today is music. And the tomato is a very convenient transition to the city of Parma, where Toscanini was from and Verdi was from nearby. Because when I started working in opera, first in Chicago, then in Italy, I lived in Emilia-Romagna, the region where Parma is and where Bologna is the capital. I went to the conservatory in Bologna. And the first time I went to Parma, I had two very distinct experiences, one in a restaurant, the other in the opera house. In the restaurant, I ordered prosciutto di Parma, which we'll talk about later. And like a good health conscious kid, I cut away all the white fat and moved it to the side and only ate the pink part. And the waiter came over and he said, basically, firmly, but politely, but very firmly, you have to eat that. You have to eat it together or you don't understand the experience. And he was right. And I learned. That was experience number one. Experience number two, the audience at the Teatro Regio in Parma is famously opinionated. And in the past, even more so. And when I went to a performance of something way back in about 1975, I think, someone didn't like something on the stage. And at the curtain call at the end of the performance, people started throwing tomatoes at the performers. And I had been told that this occasionally happens. And I was upset, number one, for the performers, but number two, the tomatoes in Parma are so good. I thought, why are you wasting these tomatoes? So, Lynn, before we get deep into Emilia-Romagna and music, Parma itself, I know it's a beloved city of yours. Right around there, unexpected to me, is a huge tomato growing zone. I think of tomatoes for Campania, for southern Italy, but why does Parma have so many tomatoes? Not just to throw at opera singers.
Well, I have to confess, I did so much research in the region, but it was quite a while ago. And I don't recall exactly why Parma and nowhere else, but I do know that Parma has for a long time had a major influence on tomato production. I mean, there's just so much coming out of tomato. But this is something interesting because at one point I managed to go to a farm where they were growing these tomatoes. And I was asking the farmer, what types of tomatoes were they growing? And he sort of chuckled, you know, and I said, I'm expecting so many of the Italian tomatoes. And he handed me a illustrated card from one of the botanical services that he used to get what he felt was the right blend of tomatoes. And almost all of them were strains that were developed here in the United States. Now, the joke, of course, of that is that means the tomato was doing a loop because the tomato came originally from Central America and Mexico, made its way to Italy via Spain, and then, you know, made its way north up to Parma from probably Sicily and Naples, and the rest is history, except for one very interesting thing. You know, I lived in Belgium for about 5 years, in Brussels, and that's where a lot of the research I did for the Splendid Table was done. And the thing that amazed me, because, you know, Brussels is further north than anywhere in our country, in the United States, the tomatoes that were grown there were startlingly delicious. And we had cool weather, you know, it was long, long periods of light. Now, let's move ahead several years. I'm in Seattle on the northwest coast of the United States, very famous for its farmers markets. And I taste tomatoes. The seeds have come from Siberia,
Huh.
and they are extraordinary. And one of the things that the grower was speculating about, I told him about the Brussels tomatoes. He said, you know, there's something to be said for long periods of sunlight during the summer, longer really than we would normally get in the United States. And he said, and the idea of cool weather, it's a very slow maturation, and that develops flavor elements that you might not find in tomatoes growing in hot sun. It's not saying they're better, but it was so curious that they had so
Sure.
much dimension to them.
Well, the parallel I use for that, in Finland, there's a city called Savonlinna, which is very far north, and they have a magnificent opera festival there every year. I've worked there on a couple of occasions. And in the market of Savonlinna, and I hope she's listening, is the gorgeous Anna, who grows the best strawberries I've ever had anywhere. And Anna explained to me that the reason the strawberries are so good is that it's cold and dark in Finland for a long time, but then in the spring and summer, there's so much light that the intensity of the sun for 23 or 24 hours a day results in strawberries that are just unlike anything else we've ever tasted. But I'm taking us back to Italy.
Okay, let's go back. But that's probably exactly what, you know, is going
Yeah.
on. That
But
long,
actually, I
long
do want to add one thing. Lynne referred to tomatoes going back and forth between different continents. In the food world, we use an expression that I teach a lot. It's very controversial now, called the Colombian Exchange. And it evokes Christopher Columbus, who sailed, he was an Italian, but he sailed for Spain from 1492 to 1506, making 4 voyages between Europe, Africa, and what we call the Americas. And he brought products from, let's call it the old world, such as wheat, cattle, vitis vinifera, wine grapes, bananas came from the Canary Islands and from Africa. Certain kinds of rice came to the Americas. From the Americas, among the products he brought were potatoes, tomatoes, pepper, turkey, chocolate, and vanilla. Imagine European food without potatoes, pommes frites, potatoes in Ireland, gnocchi, tomatoes, also corn, of course, was the other
yes,
big,
yes.
and corn went into polenta and mamaliga in Hungary and so on. This is for another time. But Christopher Columbus, yes, a controversial figure, but I believe he was the most important figure in the history of food because of the way he internationalized food products, probably not intentionally, but he did nonetheless. Olives came to the Americas. And so that's for another time. And actually, let me put in a little plug. On Sunday at 2 p.m. Los Angeles, 5 p.m. New York, and 10 o'clock in the UK and 11 o'clock in most of Europe, I'm doing a program for the Getty Museum in Los Angeles called Nourishing Genius, Food and Wine in the Time of Michelangelo. And I talk about how Michelangelo in Italy ate and drank, and we'll be tasting foods and wines. And if you miss it live, wherever you live in the world, it will be then on YouTube under Nourishing Genius, the Food and Wine of Michelangelo. Anyway, speaking of genius, Giuseppe Verdi, one of the greatest geniuses of all. Emilia Romagna has produced so many geniuses. It's kind of stunning. Giorgio Armani is from Emilia Romagna, from Piacenza. Verdi was from a little town. He was born in Roncole on October 10th of 1813. and lived for a long time in nearby Busseto, where he was in the home of Antonio Barezzi, who is a leading dealer of foods, wines, spirits, alcohol, spices, and so on, a trader, and the wealthiest man in town, and the one who became Verdi's patron for developing his musical talent as a little country boy far from the capitals of Milan and Bologna and so forth. Verdi's parents had a farm, and his mother ran probably the best trattoria in the whole area. And it was on the, the postal road between Milan and Bologna. And mail carriers with horses would come and always stop at the Verdi house in Roncole to quarter their horses, stay the night, and eat Mrs. Verdi's food. So young Giuseppe Verdi grew up surrounded by the magnificent country eating of Emilia-Romagna. Lynne, talk about the first time you went to Emilia-Romagna and the sensations of taste and flavor and all the senses that you experienced in places like Roncole, Busseto, and Parma.
Oh, how much time do we have?
We have time.
Okay. The first time I went to Emilia-Romagna was as a student of the wonderful teacher and food writer Marcella Hazan, who was a native of Emilia.
From Cesena.
Mainly Cesena. Yes, exactly, Cesena. Mm-hmm. So at any rate, that was an eye-opening experience. But what really set me on the path, so to speak, was quite a few years later. Cuisine magazine sent me there to do a major story on the region. And I had asked, they said, what do you need? And I said, first of all, I want to understand from beginning to end and the cultural significance of the food. I need a framework. I need history. I need sense of place. I don't want to be sitting in a fancy restaurant eating something and then, I can talk about it. I want to know how it's made, etc. And that was the beginning of 10 years of my life that were perhaps maybe some of the most exciting years I've ever had. And my first impressions were I couldn't get over the pasta, because the pasta, first of all, was made by hand and never with a machine. Now, my family is Tuscan and Venetian. And although I remember the pasta dough being rolled out, the sfoglia being rolled out paper thin by hand, this was not the main skill of most of the cooks in the family. I watched the sfoglinas, and that's what, to explain where that term comes from, the sheet of pasta is referred to as la sfoglia. Sfoglia means leaf. So there's this lovely sense. And a sfoglina is a woman who makes handmade pasta. And this is something interesting from the point of view of women and work and equal pay. The sfoglina could support a family on what she made. She was a highly respected craftswoman. And I
made a lot of dough.
A lot of dough, exactly. And you would go into a bakery, for instance, and there would be fresh made tortellini, little tortured bits of pasta with an extraordinary filling, and the pasta so fine you could see through it. So this was the first thing I had eaten in Italy. I had traveled in Italy, but when I went there with this focus, I was just stunned by this. And as I learned, what to ask and where to go, and people were very kind, I realized that what was happening is in the back room of that bakery or in the restaurant, someone had come in and by hand made sheets of pasta, rolled them up with a thick plastic wrap. And when you said you wanted to have a dish of tagliatelle, they would go and cut the tagliatelle, which is about 1/8 of an inch wide. But another measurement of tagliatelle is that it is, well, let's put it this way. I'm sorry, I'm going on, I know. There are two very famous medieval towers in Bologna. The tallest one is Le Asanelli. I think I'm remembering that correctly, aren't I?
And the other is the Garisenda.
That's right.
Asanelli and Garisenda. Yeah.
And the absolute exact measurement of that pasta, which is a ribbon pasta. Think fettuccine, it's similar. And may the bolognese forgive me, is 1/12,272th of the height of that tower.
Tower, yeah.
And there is a golden tagliatelle deposited in the city hall to prove it.
Yeah.
But I was eating this extraordinary pasta. And what was happening is they were going back into the kitchen. They'd make the tortellini when you ordered them. They'd cut the pasta when they ordered it. And then I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with the Sfoglinas over the years and learn so much. What I couldn't get over were the pork products. Now, I was raised in a family had pretty good, had found some pretty wonderful things. They were just outside of New York City. There were many friends in the business. Parma ham. Oh my God.
I want to get to Parma ham a bit later, Lynn. We're going to hold on Parma ham. I just want to mention a couple.
All right, I know we have.
I know we can go in many directions, but before I met you, I'm trying to think when we met, but I would guess it would be around the time that we met. Or I knew my friend Cara, who was already a friend of yours.
Yes, yeah.
And so that would be in the 80s at some point. I think I had already published my book, The Authentic Pasta Book.
Oh,
I don't know if you know that, because I lived in Emilia-Romagna and adored it in a crazy way, that as soon as I came back to the States in 1979, I proposed a cookbook about Emilia-Romagna to various publishers. And at that time in America, we didn't have a concept of regional Italian food. We might have said Southern garlic, tomatoes, Northern cream, all of which is wrong. And I said I wanted to write a book about Emilia-Romagna. And one very important editor at a very important publishing house said to me, "Is that your girlfriend?" And I said, "No, it's the region of Italy, and Bologna is the capital, and Modena and Parma," and I listed the towns. Fellini is from there, and Verdi and Pavarotti. And she said, "I don't think there'd be any interest in that. Why would we want to do that?" And I said, "Well, the pasta is magnificent, and then there are all these other things." And she came back to me a couple of years later and she said, "Well, I don't want to do this book, but I think that you should probably write a pasta cookbook, and you can cover Emilia-Romagna, but then you're going to have Rome and Tuscany and places that people care about," with what she said. And so I was glad I didn't work with her. You knew her. And I wound up with a wonderful editor and Carol Lally. And it was Carol who very intelligently said, "You need to divide the book by regions when you talk about Italy and pasta." And it was one of the first books that in English that addressed Italian food regionally. And I then went to work at the Metropolitan Opera, and I stopped writing food for a while. And then your wonderful book came out, and I was very glad because, you wrote the book that I would have tried to have written, but you did it much better. And so it really is like a Bible, The Splendid Table. And I go back and read it, especially now in the pandemic where I can't travel anywhere, to reconnect with these sensations. I'm just going to mention one more thing. I watch movies every day now of foreign places, all the places that I love to go to. But until yesterday, I couldn't watch a film set in Italy because it was just too close to me. And I watched a Fellini film. We'll talk about Fellini later. I watched it in preparation for today. But Verdi wrote his last opera was called Falstaff, and it's based on the character of Sir John Falstaff. And it's a man who loves life. It's British, of course, it's Shakespeare based. But I have discussions with my British friends and my Italian friends. Is Falstaff a British opera or is it an Italian opera? It's based on Shakespeare, The Merry Wives of Windsor mostly, and it's about everything very Elizabethan, except that the values are Italian values about the pleasures of eating, about fatalism, that when you're presented with a bad hand, you go on, you persist, you keep going. And Verdi had a very tough life, although he was very successful, and had never really written a comedy. He tried one once at the beginning of his career. To end his career with a comedy about food, wine, and sex is, to me, the perfect Emilia Romagna opera. Lynne, would you talk about in any way that you wish? It's something you and I have discussed in the past in very polite ways. The sensuality of the people of the region of Emilia Romagna. It's very
Oh,
particular.
it really is very particular. First of all, each province and the region is Emilia Romagna, Romagna being the southern part, Emilia being the northern part. Um, but it's divided into provinces of Bologna, Faenza, I'm sorry, I'm just Ferrara, um, and so on. And of
Ravenna,
course,
Rimini, Piacenza, Reggio Emilia, the forgotten one, Modena,
yes,
Parma, and so
yes.
forth.
And each area has a completely different sense of self and the food, absolutely the food. And the sensuality, I guess I don't know what it is because it's tied in with something else. This is the only region in Italy that produces and is the only place where these things can be produced. Three iconic foods of Italy, three foods that when people talk about Italy, they talk about these foods. One is prosciutto di Parma. Another one is Parmigiano Reggiano cheese. And the third one, although it was little known for a long time outside of the region, was balsamico, aceto balsamico, balsamic vinegar. And but the question that the Splendid Table never puts in print, but is asking is why this food in this place? And I think, well, let's put it this way: summer in Italy is not only happening in Emilia Romagna, but there is a way that warm air and the sense of all of those gorgeous things growing, especially the hay and the wild
Mhm.
poppies that pop up in the wheat fields, that bright red among this green wheat. It's such just incredibly sexual, if you'll pardon the expression. It's a pleasure that is taken in food is so remarkable. And I found very quickly that I'm basically someone who reacts very senses are something that drive me. I'm intellectual to a point, but the sensuality of eating, the understanding of what we have in common, everything though came to the fore in those years that I spent working in the region. It was this incredible, I mean, I couldn't take a chunk of Parmigiano without inhaling it first.
Mhm.
And going to, well, I should confess something. Busseto, which is where Verdi spent much of his life, I dubbed Verdiville because everything, when you go to Busseto, there, it's a charming little town. And it's on the Palmer Plain where it gets very hot and humid in the summer. And you go into the butcher shop and there's a shrine to Verdi, with candles. Normally where in a store there would be a picture of the king or the prime minister, there's a photograph of Verdi. And you see that all over the region of Parma. But you go into any shop and there's something there about Verdi. And it's not just cheap, tourist souvenirs. It's this treasure, this sense of treasure. And I heard a story. It's a poet, and his name now escapes me, a modern poet, writing about life along the Po River. And he talks about the osteria in Parma. It's the taverns. It's where working people, everyone goes to drink and share comradeship. And he talks about how in Parma, I'm sorry, in Busseto, the men gather at the end of the day. They drink the wine out of small cups, more as a food than as a beverage. And then how the men often will speak to each other by singing Verdi to each other. Now, supposedly, this is absolutely true. And I found one of those taverns and discovered that as soon as you walk in, you stop the very thing that you're there to hopefully at least observe. And that's another issue about traveling and about trying to understand a place, is knowing when to just back off and be the observer from a distance. One of the things, and I know you wanted me to get to this, and this is the Spala di San Segundo. Now,
Let me
San
just mention
Segundo,
the context, and then you'll get to it. Verdi had a farm just outside of Busseto in Sant'Agata. It was Villa Sant'Agata, which is a very beautiful place. And he made a lot of money with his operas. And at a certain point, he basically retired from composing and became a farmer, not a gentleman farmer, but a working farmer who kept
yeah,
his accounts. He had cattle, he had pigs, and he produced a beautiful Parmigiano. He grew grapes and made wine, and he grew all kinds of plants. He, in fact, imported banana plants, persimmons. It was often the first person in Italy to plant in these beautiful gardens we can still visit in Sant'Agata. And when people wanted to see Verdi about something musical, they had to make the significant journey to get to Sant'Agata. They would stay the night. And I've been in that home many, many times, and I know the kitchen and so forth, and they would prepare a meal. And Verdi had a family cookbook, which in effect were his mother's recipes that he would write down. And when he was trying to persuade someone to do something he wanted, and he was very tough, if he really was not getting his point across, or if he finally did, he would send the person a Spalla di San Secondo with a handwritten recipe on how to prepare it. So now that we know that, what is Spalla di San Secondo?
it is the shoulder of the pig. And the shoulder of the pig is some of the most complicated collection of muscles you will ever find on an animal. But it's a major portion. It often can weigh as much as 7 or 8 pounds. And it is boned and it's cured with salt, that's usual, and pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, which rather interesting when you think about it. And it is cured for quite a period of time. And then, and it's stuffed into a pig's bladder. That's the other thing. And then it is cooked in wine with herbs and celery, carrot, onion. And then it's served hot or cold. And there is a shop, a very famous shop in the region called Tamborini in Bologna.
Bologna.
It's in the marketplace, and it is a shop that has been there, owned by the Tamborini family for several centuries. And it's the place you go when you don't have time to go to every part of the region and you want to find the best artisanal products from every part of the region. And I got to know the then owner, not Johnny Quando Matteo, sorry, Johnny Tamborini. And on one of my many trips, I went walking in to say hello to him, greeted me with a great hug, and he said, "Oh, you are here on the perfect day. We have gotten the recipe for Verdi Spalla, which comes from the great granddaughter of his gardener. And this is our first test." And this is so typical. This is what happens in a place like Emilia Romagna. It was the whole staff was, everybody was standing around. He was slicing it. We were tasting it. And the thing about it that was interesting, because it's not dry cured as prosciutto is, etc., is that it was the essence of pig. It was wonderfully pig-like, and it had these subtle suggestions of these spices. These are sweet spices. This is what you use when you're making sweets, but such deliciousness. And it was unctuous, and it was robust. It was luscious is the best word to put it. It was supposedly Verdi's own recipe.
It was, and as a
So
reminder of the connection, his father-in-law, his sponsor first, and then future father-in-law, was Antonio Barezzi, who was the leading spice dealer in Busseto and that whole area of Emilia-Romagna. So Verdi had access to the wines, the spirits, the flavoring
Right,
that
right.
many other people would not have, and brought them to his mother and then to his own kitchen. His first wife sadly died very young, along with his two children, between 1838 and 1840. He lost his whole immediate family and became even closer to Barezzi, his father-in-law, because he was the only link to that family. And Barezzi continued to support Verdi through this difficult period. And they cooked a lot together. And Mama Verdi back in Roncole would do a lot of the cooking in addition. So I know we're going to talk about Rossini later. Rossini is thought of as being the great gastronome among composers, but I would put Verdi right there with Rossini. Um, the next piece of music that we have for Adagio listeners to listen to is La Forza del Destino by Verdi. Um, as I mentioned, his second wife was Giuseppina Strepponi. And after she sang the lead Abigaile in Nabucco in 1842 at La Scala, she retired and became eventually Mrs. Verdi. And when she was asked, what's harder, to sing Abigaile or be Mrs. Verdi, she said, absolutely Mrs. Verdi. And Abigaile is a tough role, but he's my hero, but he was a tough man in certain ways. And he was invited in 1862 to go to St. Petersburg, then the capital of Russia, to compose an opera for the Mariinsky Theater that became La Forza del Destino. Verdi said, I don't know how the food is there. I won't be happy if I'm not eating what I know. And so Strepponi, Mrs. Verdi, was given the task of equipping 3 railway cars. One of them would
Huh.
be where the Verdis would travel and live en route to Russia. The second would contain the food products of Emilia-Romagna that we mentioned, and plus many other, lots of flour, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and bottled water that he knew, and Parmigiano and aceto balsamico and prosciutto and salamis and so forth for the 5-month sojourn. For wine, she had to provision another railway car, but not the wines of Emilia-Romagna. He preferred French wine. So Bordeaux's and Burgundies were provisioned somewhere, I think in Lyon, but I'm not certain, maybe Paris. And that car was transported to Berlin. The Verdi 2 cars, their residence and the food car, went from Parma to Berlin, or maybe Milan to Berlin. The cars were joined in Berlin. They continued to St. Petersburg, and Verdi lived and worked in St. Petersburg for 5 months, dining on his food, and importantly, inviting people to dinners in St. Petersburg. So Russia has some great food, and my family is partially from St. Petersburg, but this food was something sensational. So Verdi revolutionized fine dining in St. Petersburg, and also some of the wines, with the presentation of these foods that he brought in 1862. So that's our man Verdi. The third person, of course, the third work, of course, is Aida. Now, Aida doesn't have a particular food context, but the recording we selected stars Renata Tebaldi, who is from Langhirano, and Carla
Yeah.
Burgonzi, who is from Busseto. So let's start with Langhirano, Lynn. Langhirano and prosciutto di Parma. How do you make prosciutto di Parma?
It's a fascinating process because this is one of the finest hams to be eaten anywhere in the world. It's incredibly complex on the palate, and there are only 3 ingredients: salt, air, and thyme. First of all, you start out with a pig that has spent at least the last 4 months of its life within the province of Parma. And the pig does eat acorns. The pig is never fed any kind of, I don't know how to put it, an artificial food, anything that's been fermented. Uh, and the pig has to be a particular weight. There's a term among prosciutto makers that you want a pig that is molto fatto, meaning well-made. It must be a mature animal, so that the more mature the muscle is, the less water it has in it, because water is where bacteria grows. And that's the thing you never want in meat that you're going to be drying. So you look at a pig, they are looking at it, they're judging it from the point of view of its conformation, its age, the quality of its meat. There's something else about this too. If an animal has been bruised on one side of his body, the other leg will never cure, which is very interesting. So what happens is these legs are taken, they're more or less packed in sea salt, and it takes about 20, 25 days. And in the midst of that, it may be washed and then repacked. This is the salting period. This is also where the great dance of humidity and temperature are played. You need enough humidity that the meat will not dry out and the salt is being absorbed into the muscle, but you have to have the temperature low enough that it will not be over-absorbed, and then you have heavily salted meat. See, the easiest way to preserve a piece of meat is to salt the you-know-what out of it, and it'll be edible, but it'll be awful also. And this is where the finesse comes in with Parma ham and a lot of other great hams. So after that, it goes through a period of where it's just hung to dry. And by the way, this is all happening at ground level. Mm-hmm. Then they do something that's very interesting. If you cut a leg away from a pig or any animal, there is a large area of raw meat. Well, they take a lard and they pack that into that area to essentially not allow that area to dry out too much. But there's always, between where the fat comes and the raw meat begins, a fine line left in that curve, which is at the thickest part of the beak. It's toward the top of that circular, more or less circular area that you rub with the lard. And that is there for testing. And now what happens is the ham, which at this point is salted meat, which everyone disdains, goes to the very top of the building. Now, Langherano sits at more or less at the peaks of the Apennines in Parma province, and there's a flow of air that comes from the other side of the leg of the boot, comes off of the sea. And it's claimed that that cool air, supposedly carrying some sort of saltiness as well, comes through, and that's what starts to have the pig or the pork naturally metabolize and change. The enzymes begin to change. And if you go to Langherano, because hams used to usually only be made, that the pig would be slaughtered in January, and then the ham would be aged about 2 years. But the idea is, if you go to Langherano, you'll see the old ham houses. They're tall, they look like narrow apartment buildings, and they're all pitched at an angle. And they all have windows that open, open shutters. They're all pitched at an angle to capture that breeze, so it can pass through those top floors and then the floors below. Now, of course, a lot of this is temperature controlled because the hams are created 12 months out of the year. But very gradually, the proteins in the ham start to convert, enzymes develop, and the ham makes its way very slowly over a year to 2 years, over 2 years, down to the cellar. And that's where it is hung. And that's where the testing is done. It's done along the way, but the final test is done. And how the testing is done is fascinating. The testers use what's called, it's a horse bone. And a horse bone is used because it's not porous and it will not hold scent. And it's essentially, a bone about this long, and it's been tapered to a point, a sharp point. And what they do is they take this ham, they go to the side of the ham where the strutto or lard has been spread. They go to that little open crack and they hit here and they smell, and they hit here and they smell, they hit here and they smell. And what they're doing is, these are the areas that the major blood vessels go through the ham. And in just that few moments of smell, they can smell if it's rancid. They can smell if the ham is in good condition. Any ham that's considered rancid is disposed of. You don't go any further with it. And finally, it goes down to the cellar, and there's where they're aged. And it's a forest of hams. And the aroma of this is extraordinary. There's this funky but sweet and delicious aroma. You've been, right? You know,
yes, I'm sure.
It's like nothing on earth. Yeah. Yeah. That's the other thing about Emilia Romagna that I loved. The understanding of what fermentation is about, and what it speaks to you about the sensuality. Because I'll tell you a story in a few moments when we get to talking about Parmigiano Reggiano of aroma. And the idea of the ham is it must be sweet, just enough salt to preserve it, and it must be sweet. And then you come to eating the ham. Now, in Parma, when you go into a salumeria, a shop that sells all the cured products, and often will have cheese as well, you choose your age of your ham, and you also can decide, do you want to cut from this part of the ham, or this part of the ham, or this part of the ham? Because they will have all of that ready for you. And when you get to the very top of the ham, that's what everybody wants to have at home. It's very strong. It's quite strong because it's not as dense as the other areas are, but it's perfect for seasoning. So you'll often see that hanging, and you'll just take a little slice and it goes into the pan when you're sauteing the green beans. Mm-hmm. But you never, in Parma, it is never served with fruit. Melon and cheese is the invention of a barbarian, according to the Parmigiani. You do not serve it with butter. That'll raise a great bone of contention. And I can remember being in a little place out on the plain where someone asked for butter to go with their prosciutto, and someone from another table came over, politely introduced themselves, and said, in effect, in very, very polite Italian, "I'm not quite sure where you're from, but we're so glad you've come to our region. But if you want to taste the greatness of the prosciutto, don't eat it with butter." So you're supposed to have a little bit of that wonderful Malvasia wine that comes from the hills of Parma,
white
and bread,
wine, yeah.
White wine and bread. That's it, no more.
Mm-hmm. I just want to specify one thing that you and I know that not everyone may know. This is the hind leg, the rear leg of the pig.
Oh my gosh! Yes, excuse me. Oh my!
Not
how
the
could
front.
I ever possibly?
And
oh dear.
Which becomes zampone, which is another thing that we can talk about. But if we think of the anatomy of any animal, but certainly the pig, there's the leg, and just above that is the butt, the buttocks, or the Italians might say the culo. And not up in the mountains where Langhirano is, where Tebaldi was from, but down in Busseto, where Verdi and Carla Burgonzi were from, just at the Po River, is a town called Zibello. And in Zibello, they make a product called culatello, which is slightly rude, but in a very nice way. And culatello is the butt. It's the part above the leg. When they do the cutting, the leg goes to Langhirano and the butt goes to Zibello. And this is aged differently because it's aged in moisture, because it's very humid and damp by the Po River. It gets a darker red than the prosciutto, which is very pink, and is exquisitely delicious as well. And this is what Verdi, yes.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
But it is not, the entire leg is cured as prosciutto. And then down there, the thing is, as you know, the humidity and the heat down there won't allow a big piece of meat to cure safely. So what they do is they take the leg and they take what we would call the top and the bottom round, which is the largest collection of muscle, and it's on one side of the bone. And that becomes the culatello. And then there is a long strip of a muscle that becomes fiocchetti. Mm-hmm. I'm always doubting my pronunciation because
that's good.
Okay, I'm all right. I'm good. Okay, it's been a long time. And then there's another part of it that becomes, as I recall, salami. But what I was interrupting you to say is that the rarity of great farm-made culatello. Oh, God, when you have one, I've got to tell you a story.
Yep.
I was on a press trip to Parma, and we were guests of the Parmigiano Reggiano people, and a young writer who was, she did not write about food at all. In fact, she had very little interest in food. She confessed that she really had been delighted to be invited on the trip, but she was going to probably be writing about travel, etc. And she was sitting, and I said to her, well, let me tell you a few things you might want to kind of have your ears perked for. Well, we arrived in Parma and we went to a restaurant that both you and I love, and I can't remember the name of now. And they were serving us a typical welcome meal, which was 3 pastas, each served one after the other, never on the same plate, which is something I see. But anyway, I get very upset. And then after that, or before that, we had had the antipasti, and we had had some of the specialties, and then out came the culatello. And through all this, I was chatting with her, and she was saying, oh, this is delicious. This is wonderful. Well, as the culatello came out, I was talking to someone else, and she tugged on my shoulder. And I'm going to start to swell up. She had tears in her eyes, Fred.
I get
This
it.
woman who concerned, I'm not knocking her, but she was very fashionable. You know, she couldn't eat pork, etc. She had tears in her eyes. She said, oh my God, now I understand. Converted her instantaneously. The rest of the trip, she was on top of every wonderful thing that we were served. But that's
But this seriously explains something about the people and the creativity in the region. It's not just that they eat well, because people eat well in many parts of the world, but the connection of the senses, the experiencing of all of this on many levels. People who know me at all well, I explain to them that if you've not seen me, not just in Italy, but specifically Emilia-Romagna, you don't get me. I went there when I was 19, and I lived there for 3 years as a young man, and therefore I was made the person I became, and my values and my perspective on so many things were basically made in Bologna and the surrounding region. And while I traveled to a lot of Italy, and I especially adore Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, and Liguria, especially, to get me, you really have to go to these places, because my alertness to sound, sight, smell, taste, touch really were awakened in that place. And I see it when I see Verdi and Fellini and Rossini, and I worked a lot with Pavarotti and Freni. In my pasta book, my recipe for the ragu, the bolognese meat sauce, is from the opera singer Ruggero Raimondi. It's his recipe because he taught it to me. I had many versions and I love it, but he was from Bologna, is from Bologna, really was the essential ragu, the meat sauce of Bologna, which is different from the one you get in Modena, which is a little whiter, and it varies from town to town to town. Now, you want to talk about Carla Burgonzi, who is from Busseto, who had the hotel. Last week, I had Luca Pizzaroni on, and I love Luca. He's a vegetarian, and he's from Busseto. But he used to eat meat as a young man, and he was trained in part by Carla Burgonzi and spent a lot of time in that kitchen with the maestro. And talk about his hotel and who he was, not just as a singer.
One of my great regrets was that I stayed there, I don't know how many times, with our wonderful friend Cara da Silva.
Yep.
And it is, how can I describe it, Dewey Foscari? It's a time capsule. And I don't mean that in the musty, dusty corners. It's exquisite, elegant. There's wonderful memorabilia of Verdi, but it's not, this is hard to put into words. Sometimes you go to a place that is honoring a person or a period or a time. And it's the feeling I always get, my term is everything's behind a glass case, it's in a glass case. It doesn't have to do with you. It's not immediate. It's not hitting you in your heart. It's not making you stop for a moment and catch your breath. It doesn't make you feel as though you've been transported to another time or to another collection of sensibilities. But Dewey Foscari and that whole town, that's what happens. And I get very, I'm sorry to do this, but
Mhm.
that place is magical to me,
Yeah.
really magical. And I used to go to Parma. I would drive down from Brussels. And you should know that the trip from Brussels, our house at Square de la Fin, our home, our apartment, to downtown Parma is 11 hours and 39 minutes. The Volkswagen Golf that was a diesel, which meant climbing. Once I actually went through the St. Bernardo Pass, which is the pass that separates Italy from Switzerland, and discovered that a diesel Golf just goes chugga-bun, chugga-bun, chugga-bun all the way up. But I would drive into Parma and I'd be going over one particular bridge to the hotel I always stayed at, which is the smallest rooms you've ever seen in your life.
Yes.
And I would give out this whoop, this, and I would start just humming Verdi, pick because that place is so alive. It is, the food touches you, the history touches you. You go to Bussetto. I mean, when I walked into that butcher shop, it was a curiosity, and then it wasn't a curiosity. That was a serious tribute to someone who was treasured as not only a great musician, but as a human being. And I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if that butcher shop might have originated or been in existence at his time. I think also my favorite rendition of Verdi is the statue that's in the square in front of Dewey Foscari. Oh, I should mention, Dewey Foscari has the best bar. It's all dark wood. There is one of the great theatrical posters of Verdi. And I don't remember exactly what opera it was, but I remember there was an incredible amount of red in it. And you're in this cozy, dark, very elegant little room, and you're sipping liqueurs, and you're sitting there thinking, the man who created this has sung Verdi probably much of his life.
Mhm.
And it's all there, the spirit. And there's a wide staircase that takes you up to the rooms. And the rooms are all airy and open, but you never forget you're in the 19th century when you're there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just completely. And then the statue is Verdi sitting. And it reminded me, there's a statue in Washington of Albert Einstein. And it's this very similar position. And children often climb up it and sit on his lap. And that's the suggestion of Verdi. And somewhere there's a picture of me on his lap.
Uh,
Uh, it, and then next to it
I
is
always think
the,
of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington because Verdi's arms are sort of placed on the armrests and his head is
yeah,
slightly down.
yeah,
And
true. But it has the coziness and the appeal
yeah, of
emotionally of
Einstein.
the other. I've no offense to Abe Lincoln. He was
No.
a fabulous man, a wonderful man. I really, yeah. But I had to sit in Verdi's lap.
I want to take us down the road to Parma. The next recording I selected was Toscanini and other Parma composers and musicians. Toscanini, we don't know this, Arturo Toscanini, in addition to knowing Verdi and conducting Verdi's works, knowing Puccini, and basically being the most important Italian opera conductor ever, was also a composer. He also was very much a passionate anti-fascist. There is a wonderful book, the series of wonderful books by a man named Harvey Sachs, who is the definitive Toscanini expert, and I commend them. And Toscanini's house is on the opposite side of the river from the theater in sort of the Borgo, the quote, poor neighborhood, the working class neighborhood. And around the corner from Toscanini's house is what's called the Corale Verdi, the Verdi Choral Society. And these are people who get together and sing Verdi's music. And then they have an adjoining very large restaurant, one of the largest I've ever seen in Italy, where they gather and have huge platters of food and sing. And when I bring people to Parma, we visit Toscanini's house. I teach them about Toscanini, and then we go around the corner to the Corale Verdi and eat these amazing foods. But he was very poor, Toscanini, growing up, and he knew good food. He knew good everything, but he was much more focused on the passionate political
Mhm.
intense side of Emilia Romagna, the very often progressive, although Mussolini was from Emilia Romagna, but often very progressive, very focused on liberty and freedom that Verdi focused on. And I do want to mention him in passing, and it brings us to Parmigiano Reggiano cheese, Lynn. And before we focus just on that, I want to mention that the most overlooked town in the region, there are two. One is Piacenza, and the other is Reggio Emilia. Reggio
Yes.
Emilia is very close to Parma, but it's its own province. It's between between Modena and Parma, and it is the city that's considered to have the best early education in the world. And
It's
people go
renowned
to
for it,
Reggio
isn't
Emilia to study early education and the development of children through what they learn about their food, their culture, their history, socialization, art, and so on. So we forget about it. My sfogliine were actually from Reggio Emilia, where I learned to make sfoglia. And it's called Parmigiano Reggiano cheese. People say Parmesan, they say Parmigiano. It is both Parma and Reggio. So
it?
take it away, Lynn.
There's a lot of strong feelings in that name. That name encompasses a tremendous, I think, almost a war of identity because the people of Reggio, I think, have felt in terms of the cheese, especially, that the importance of Reggio has been overlooked completely. And the reality is the cheese was born in both areas along as I remember, it's the Reggio River. Yeah, I'm double checking because memory is not working in my favor. This is a cheese that can only be made in 5 provinces in the entire Emilia-Romagna region. And a little
Actually,
bit,
may I correct you? 4 provinces in Emilia-Romagna, one in Lombardy. It's
yes, yes,
Mantova in Lombardy and Parma, Reggio, Modena, Bologna in Emilia-Romagna.
right. And there's that little bit of the region that bumps over the Po River, which is the one side of the one border of the entire region is the Apennine Mountains, and the other border is the Po River. Which, to put it in its proper place, think of, for those of us in the United States, think of the Mississippi River, the importance of that river. Think of the Danube. Think of the Thames. That's what the Po River is, and has a lot to do with the politics and the power plays and what happened at the table. Um, but with Parma and Reggio, first of all, is where I had some of the best lardo I've had in my life. Uh, this is the thing to understand, that when you talk about Parma and you talk about Reggio, you're talking about the worship of the pig. There is not one part of that pig, as you know, Fred, that is not treated as though it is the treasure of Sierra Madre. You know, it is just so precious. And I remember being taken to lunch by some people from the Consorzio del Formaggio Parmigiano Reggiano. And they taking me to this, of course, it's always the little places, you know, it's never the fancy tourist places. It's the little place that you go up a country road and then you go up a smaller country road and a smaller country road and there's no sign, but you're there. That's where it is. And of course, the place was filled up. And on the antipasto table that you see when you walk into the restaurant is the ham and the great cheese. By the way, 3 cheeses, as I remember, because they were different ages. Or
Yeah.
one was mountain, one was plain, you know, that kind of thing. And there was this great snowy white sort of chunk, and it was being sliced paper thin. It was being put on plates with a little sprig of fresh thyme and a few drops of aceto balsamico tradizionale, which we'll talk about later, this magnificent vinegar. And you ate it that way. You were eating pig fat. And I was sort of, I mean, I knew about pig fat, but this was going a little far. Well, it was, of course, out of this world, absolutely out of this world. And many years later, the famous chef, up until fairly recently, an American chef, Mario Batali, who had studied in Italy, had trained in the mountains of Emilia-Romagna, discovered this. And he found someone who could do this for him in the United States. And he was going to put it on the menu. And I asked him, how are you going to sell pork fat to Americans, especially in the days when fat-free was so important and all of that? And he said, I'm calling it white prosciutto.
Yep.
And that was, but this was such a statement, the importance of this animal and every bit of it. And Parma is like a second home to me. I would come across that river, I'd give my whoop, I'd park my car, I'd drop my bags at the hotel, and I'd walk over to the main square in Parma, or adjacent to the main square, and there was a gnocco frito stand. And now there's gnocco frito, and then there's other fritos, but it's always the same thing. It's essentially a little bread dough that's been fried. And it's the best snack in the world. And you know, I forgot to mention something. Usually there is that fried bread that is served with the spalla, too, in rectangles. I don't know if you remember, but sure. It's traditional with it. So, and that would be the beginning. And one of the things that, when you talk about the sensuality of this place, I spent many years learning and learning again and learning again from the wonderful people, dear friends, from the Consorzio, Renzo Cattabiani, Mario Zanoni, Leo Bertozzi, and yeah. They really taught me a great deal. And there's one very funny thing about this. That very first trip, these people hosted me, and they took me all over the region to learn about Parmigiano. And I'm asking deep, piercing questions that only a journalist can ask about the history, about et cetera. And in the midst of this, as we're driving across the plain, one of them leans over and says, Lynn, have you noticed anything in all of this drive we've done? And I'm thinking, gee, I can't think what it could be. Well, we hadn't seen a cow.
Yes.
And you know, that was the moment when I thought, enough of this. You know, lady, you really have no idea where you are, what you're doing. Ask the question, close your mouth, and keep your eyes open. But the reality is that as you know, the population has grown, et cetera, the land in Emilia-Romagna, as in other places, has become very, very precious. And there is not enough room for the grazing, that the cows will get the amount to eat that they need. And so what happens is the cows stay in these extremely comfortable stalls. I picture chaise lounge, you know, perhaps a small TV set, people fanning them, and the farmer brings the hay and the cut grass to them. And when that cheese is made, it is made by a cheese maker. The farmer will bring the night milking, the night milking of the milk to the cheese house. It will be put in a shallow pan and left overnight. And what happens is the cream rises. Cream is skimmed off, which ends up being the best butter you'll ever put in your mouth.
Yes.
And then the morning milking is brought in, and that combination is put in this great, it looks like an upside down copper bell, and it has heat under it. It has a jacket of heat. Originally, it was done over open fires. And what is interesting about this is that the cheesemaker will know every single cow that gives milk that goes into the cheeses he makes. And if it were let's say it's your cows and your milk, yours would always go into number one cauldron. Maybe with mine if we were small producers. But that meant that if anything went wrong, every cheese is labeled with a number and with an ID. And that meant that it could always be traced back right away to where the problems might be with the milk. So this cheese is made completely by hand. It's heated with rennet to separate the curd, with the whey from the day before. It's shaped, it's formed, it goes into a salt bath, and then the drying process begins. And the drying process is the whole key, the drying and the aging. And the aging is always done in large rooms, plenty of air, and it's usually done on pine wood shelves. And what happens is the cheese maker will periodically turn those cheeses. So they will constantly be exposed on all sides to the air. And they're called cheese banks. And there actually have been bank robberies of cheeses because these cheeses weigh about 40 pounds and they're very valuable. And when it's finally been tested, it will be stamped and it always has the year and the month on it, which is good to know because you generally, a 2-year-old Parmigiano is prime. A 3-year-old is, it's like it has the muscle and it has let's put it this way. If you're drinking a lighter red wine, let's say a really good Beaujolais, has a lot of character, you're eating a 2-year-old Parmigiano. If you're drinking a Morgon Beaujolais that has been aged quite a bit more, or better yet, a good Burgundy, now you're into the 3-year-old. And every one of the cheeses will taste different. And it depends on the season, it depends on the locality, and it depends on the cow. You have brown cow Parmigiano and you have red cow Parmigiano. But the thing that really taught me the greatest lesson, by the way, I don't think this is an exaggeration. It's often referred to as one of the 3 great cheeses in the country, in the world rather. And it is, and it's been treasured and sold internationally for 500 or 600 years. I was
Boccaccio wrote about it in the Decameron when he was talking about a very orgiastic experience, basically having sex with someone by taking your clothes off on a mountain of grated Parmigiano and
Yes, that's right. Of course, I forgot
rolling
about that.
down and being covered in the Parmigiano as you reach an orgasm.
Yes, yes, rolling around in it. It's a wonderful.
Lynn, I want to add a couple of things. One is that there's an expression going back to pigs briefly in Emilia Romagna, la musica di Verdi è come il maiale, non si spreca niente. In other words, the music of Verdi is like a pig, nothing goes to waste.
Yes, exactly.
And they made that equation. I want to add too that in Parma and Reggio and in the 5 provinces where they make Parmigiano Reggiano, they have what you refer to as banks, but in fact, real banks where we used to put our money in those areas have store places, because if your cheese is not going to be good for another couple of years, how does the farmer make money? The cheesemakers. So what they do is once the form has been made, it's transported to these storage places in the bank as collateral. And the bank advances money to the farmer so that when the cheese is ready for sale, then the farmer pays back some of the money. It is also known in Emilia Romagna that for every round of cheese, and these are large, that is sold, 3% of the money earned goes to support the arts in Emilia Romagna. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a direct link between Parmigiano Reggiano and supporting opera, music, and dance and theater and so forth in the region. I'm going to take us further down the road past Reggio. And by the road is called the Via Emilia, which begins in Milan and goes into Emilia Romagna, Piacenza, all the big towns. Verdi's home where his mother was on the Via Emilia. And we now get to Modena. And Modena is often called the wealthiest city in Italy. It shares that title with a few other places. But Modena is where very famous sports cars are from. I'm not a driver, but magnificent food, but also 2 of the greatest opera singers ever, Mirella Freni and Luciano Pavarotti, were both born in Modena, she in February, he in October of 1935. And their mothers were poor and worked in a tobacco factory in Modena, kind of like the women in Carmen. And
Mhm.
because they had contact with tobacco, they were not allowed to breastfeed their children, their babies. So they
How
had
wise.
a woman who was a wet nurse who breastfed both Morella Freni and Luciano Pavarotti. And as Morella once said to me, you could see who got all the milk.
I love that. I love
And
that.
they were childhood friends. Her career began before his. He made his singing debut as a soloist in La Boheme, not in Modena, as is often thought, but in Reggio Emilia was his debut.
The famous
Just
thing.
yeah. And you know that I was a consultant on a film. I was the opera advisor. A documentary by Ron Howard came out last year about Pavarotti. And I am happy to say that he was my friend and collaborator for 29 years. We cooked together. He gave me a recipe for my book. We spent tons of time together in Italy and especially New York. And Luciano had on the stove in his apartment in New York, il brodo, the broth. Now, most places where they boil pasta, they boil it in water, salted water.
Right.
In Modena and other parts of Emilia Romagna, they use capon broth to boil pasta, so it has even more flavor.
How
He is an opera.
sane.
Hmm? He
How
is an opera
sane.
singer. Always wanted to have broth to sip to keep himself warm and also his throat hydrated. And there were these magnificent, you entered his apartment and the smell was of capon broth, which had saffron and some pork and other things that would go in. But that was the elixir of love for me, not wine. This amazing broth. And so, Lynn, I know that you've spent a lot of time in Modena because, among many reasons, they're famous for the aceto balsamico tradizionale,
Yeah.
traditional. And again, poor Reggio Emilia is forgotten because only two towns are allowed to officially make it, Modena and Reggio. So Reggio is the only one that makes two of the three official products, namely the Parmigiano Reggiano and the Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale.
That's interesting that you bring. Yes.
And
Yes.
I feel bad for them. And my Svoglina in Reggio would always complain to me, ma nessuno ci conosce. No one knows us. Here in Reggio. They make wonderful bollito, boiled meats of different kinds with sauces in Reggio. I'm encouraging people to go to Reggio Emilia because a lot of the other towns, while still wonderful, have been discovered thanks to your book, thanks to my writing, thanks to a lot of other people, thanks to Mario Batali cooking and all that. A lot of people know Emilia Romagna, but Reggio Emilia remains really undiscovered. So we'll go there.
I
But
think, yes, you're right. And the other thing is take a car and drive up into the hills and out on the plain. And especially in the summer or in the spring, when every shade of green you can imagine is out there on that plain. And when you go up and you're going to discover all kinds of things up in the hills as you drive up into the hills. Frog, which
yeah,
comes in season in the spring, and you see big signs, rane frite. And you stop and you have a bowl, and there's usually a flipper hanging out, and you're eating frog. And it's just not the legs, but the whole broth
no,
that
I
is sweet.
know.
Yeah. But for
So,
Modena, for me,
Accetto
Modena,
Balsamico Tradizionale.
yes, yes,
Tell us
exactly.
about it.
Well, let's see how to explain. This is a vinegar that can be aged centuries. It is drunk as a liqueur. It is the dowry of one of the most important parts of the dowry of any young bride, because so many families, not so much today, but almost every family that could do it would have a balsamico attic. It is today sold a 3.5 ounce specially designed bottle that tells you its origin and that it has been tested can sell for up to about $250. And the true Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale, the traditional, takes a minimum of 12 years to make. But really, when you take a 12-year-old Balsamico, what's in that bottle can be something up to 100 and more years old. And this is how it works. Unlike wine, which is made down in a cellar, Balsamico is made in attics with the windows open because it goes through. Modena and Reggio share the weather. Intense cold in the winter, intense heat and humidity in the summer. And these extremes work on the vinegar. So this is how it works. You start out with ideally the Trebbiano grape, but there are some other grapes that are allowed. And when you press the grape and you get the juice, that's called the mosto, the fresh pressed grape juice. Well, usually that is then added with some yeast added to it, that ferments, and it turns into wine. Well, and then usually wine makes vinegar, but not with Aceto Balsamico. You don't go through that step of the wine being acidified. You don't make wine. You take the mosto and you cook it overnight over a fire in a big cauldron. You're reducing it down. You're intensifying it slightly. Then it goes into a big barrel up in the attic. Now, near that barrel is going to be a line of barrels going from I think it's about 50 quarts or 50 gallons, down to the smallest one, which will be
a barrique.
Huh?
A barrique.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'll be small. It'll be perhaps 1.5 gallons.
Yeah.
Every one of those barrels has a hole in the top that's covered with muslin. That's so that air can get in, but no bugs. And they're usually on a rack. And when you go in, and it's the attic is called the acciaia, the acid or vinegar attic. And often you'll see in a family attic several rows, and in some cases, many rows. Now, that's part of the process. But what you have to know is it can be that each one of those barrels is made out of a different wood. So as this liquid passes through them, it picks up different flavors. It could be cherry, it could be oak, juniper, chestnut, etc. Okay, we've got all that down. So now what happens is every single year, you go to the littlest barrel. This is the precious stuff, okay? And you remove a bit of it. And this is what is given to honored guests. This is what is sipped as a what you would call it, a liqueur. This is what you dribble over ice cream, and it's unbelievable. But you never empty that barrel. What you do is you top it off from the next barrel, and you top off that barrel from the next barrel, and so on and so on. And finally, the musto from last year that's been patiently waiting goes into the largest barrel. So you see, by the time you get down here, and the last edition was done from 25 years ago, you've got an incredible mixture, which means that no two balsamicos will ever taste the same. Now, there is a consorzio of the Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale, and that vinegar to be sold, let's say you want to sell your vinegar, you've sent it to the headquarters of the consorzio in a numbered or in a tank of some sort. They will give it a number, and then there will be a tasting of, let's say, 6 different submissions. And a call goes out to the official tasters, and they could be your neighbors, they could be you. This is someone who has trained with the vinegar and tastes no less than 100 different vinegars a year. And they never are to remark that they're going for a tasting, because it might be their great friends up the road who have brought in the vinegar. And they taste separated by partitions, so they can't see each other. And there are 40 different categories that the judgment is based on. And it's a numerical process. And it passes or it fails. You apply for a 12-year-old or a 25-year-old. And when it passes, you will be asked to send your labels to the consortio. You will never touch the vinegar again, but it will then be decanted. And the bottles from Modena are shaped sort of with a little column here, and then they have a round base. And they're only about this big. And it will be called Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale from Fred Plotkin. The same system is used in Reggio, except in Reggio, they grade. They have the silver medal, they have the bronze, and then they have the gold. And that is a slight difference. But in any of those cases, you can line up from this maker and this maker and this maker, balsamico, and taste it, and it will all be different. And the first time I ever had that experience was I was sent to meet Giuseppe Giusti, who has one of the, it's the Giusti Salumeria, the family Salumeria, is first of all one of the most picturesque you'll see anywhere. It's beautiful. And he was the person who had an attic, and he invited people in. And this gentleman took me up. I'm not being able to talk anymore. His store is in the oldest part of Modena, the old palazzi. And it turns out that the family owned several of them. So he took me up in the attic, and you're walking on floors that are doing this. And there's the lineup of the vinegars. And he's explaining to me how it works. And he now is taking a glass pipette, and he's taking the muslin off the little barrique, and he's dipping it in, and he has a tiny, lovely little glass. And I'm going to taste vinegar. Now, I had never, the only balsamic vinegar I knew was Fini. And I'm thinking, how am I going to taste vinegar and not screw up my nose and insult this man? It was a revelation.
It's ambrosia.
Ambrosia, absolutely ambrosia. And this one had a deep, thundering kind of quality to it. And then he takes me up to another row, new pipette, go in, similar glass, and I'm tasting a spring meadow. And he explained that both of these barrels had come from, or this whole lineup had come from his great-grandfather. They were from the same year of grapes, but because of the woods and all of these little variabilities, how thick a barrel is, how thin a barrel is, all of that added up to this remarkable experience. That's Aceto Balsamico. And the regard that goes into this, the celebration of it. I mean, the highest honor you are paid when you're a guest in someone's home there is that they will bring out
the bottle.
Yeah.
So I want to make clear for our listeners that this is not the bottle of so-called balsamic vinegar you buy for €3 in Aldi in Europe or at Costco for $3 in the United States. This is a very rare product. It is not meant to mix with olive oil to put on your salad.
Yeah.
It is dosed out in droppers. When I've done wine tastings, and often I need my mouth to be purified and corrected, I'll put one drop on my tongue and let it suffuse in the mouth. And that
really?
puts it right. That's the perfect way to correct my mouth after tastings of any kind of food. But also balsamic, balsam, it was used as a medicine in the past.
Yeah.
It means, because this is an area, especially Bologna, of great medical schools, and it was used for that purpose. It is dosed out, as you said. You might put a drop on Parmigiano Reggiano. You might put, if you make beautiful scrambled eggs, a drop on the scrambled eggs, or make a risotto Parmigiano Reggiano and then put a drop in the risotto. Things like that, but really a drop, because especially when it encounters heat, such as scrambled eggs or risotto, it suffuses into the food that you're eating, and then you really savor it. It's not salad dressing. You mentioned something that I was going to mention, so I'll pick up from you. Giusti in Modena. The family, the producer of Giusti Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale, they're very good friends of mine, in full disclosure. So I'm not going to promote them, but like you, I love their Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale, and you can rely on them if you were looking for a good quality product. But Giusti, the shop, was taken over a number of years ago by a man who sadly died, but his wife Laura is still there and his son,
She is.
Giuliano Morandi.
Yes.
And this, to me, for many years, was the greatest restaurant in Italy, because behind the store from 1605, Nano and Laura created a 5-table restaurant. There was no menu. You ate what Laura made, and it was just heavenly. I found it before I was friends with Pavarotti. He and I would go there a fair amount. And he basically would always say, his expression with a lot of people was when you wanted to cook for him, I'll eat whatever you give me. He said that to me all the time. And with Laura, he would just say, I'll eat whatever you give me. That is where I encountered the broth for the first time. That is where the most masterful use of the aceto is found. They're not always open that often, and it's hard to get into because it's 5 tables.
Well, I remember, yeah.
They've maintained the quality rather than expand. It has a fantastic address, Vicolo Squalore, the little street of squalor, number
Yeah.
46. And the reason I went there originally was I lived in Bologna, which is 30 minutes or so from Modena, 18 kilometers, 30 kilometers, 18 miles. And I would go to Modena a fair amount. And I went there because I am a huge lover of Gioacchino Rossini, the man, the musician, everything. And Rossini studied, as did Mozart, at the same conservatory in Bologna where I studied many years later. And he was just my hero. Verdi in a different way for his nobility and so on, but Rossini for his spirit. And he ordered his food from Giusti. And when he moved to Paris to live in Paris, he ordered his food, his aceto, his parmigiano, his prosciutto, all of that to be shipped from Giusti to Paris for him to eat in Paris and to serve to his guests. In Bologna, my favorite city in Italy, wonderful though Parma and these other places are, but for me, it's really Bologna. Um, Rossini studied at the conservatory, ate in its trattorias. The food markets to me are just the best in the world. My
Mhm.
culinary education really came in Bologna because I lived about a 7-minute walk from the central markets from Tamburini that you mentioned. Atti was the store where they made pasta
Oh,
by hand. All of
yeah.
these places, and I knew the market. La Baita was the great cheese store for squacquerone, local cheese. And every day, think about this, a 20-year-old college student, twice a day I went to the market. I went in the late morning for my lunch, and then I would go back in the evening to decide what I wanted for dinner. And if I was in the mood, say, to make a salad with tomatoes, and I would go to the market and I would say, I want that tomato. In most of the world, even most of Italy, they would say, how many? In Bologna, they would say, what are you using the tomato for? And I would say, this is for a salad I'm making tonight. No, this is for sauce, and this is for slow cooking, and this tomato is the one you want for the salad, but this is the one you want tonight because smell it.
Uh-huh.
And that's how, because again, most markets in the world, you touch your food, you pick. Not in Italy, and especially not in Bologna. They select it for you. So every product in front of me, whether it was fish, chicken, poultry, whatever, the question always was, how are you going to prepare it? Will you use salt? What spices will you use? Which meant that every market stall knew how to cook. And they would have, if I wanted to make a broth, a vegetable broth, they would have different vegetables prepared to give to me to make my broth and explain how to do it. So my cooking education really came from that market. And there is something called the salamoia bolognese.
Yes.
Salamoia is like a salt blend. It has sage and other things. And when I go to Bologna, I buy a jar to bring back because that's the flavor of Bologna, this particular combination.
Mhm.
Brings me to Rossini, who went to the same markets, and so did Michelangelo, as I will discuss on Sunday. And Rossini loved to cook. He was a great cook. And he wrote an opera, one of his great operas called Tancredi.
Oh, yes.
And the aria in Tancredi, one of them is called Di Tanti Palpiti, sung by a mezzo soprano. In our choice here at Adagio, it's Marilyn Horne. And Rossini referred to this as the rice aria. And he was asked, well, why rice? There's no mention of rice. He said, I wrote it in the time it took to make a risotto. So for Rossini, all these parallels were made between cooking times and preparations and the times to write his music. So we don't think of rice too much for the region of Emilia-Romagna. It's there,
It's there, yeah.
but it's more grown further north in the Veneto and in Lombardy and Piemonte. But there's a very famous film from 1953 called Riso Amaro, Bitter Rice, starring
Okay.
Vittorio Gassman and Silvana Mangano. And this is a story of women who went to Piemonte, to Vercelli, to pick the rice, and they lived in terrible conditions and were often raped by men. And it was a terrible story, um, and very dramatic and very near-realistic. But what a lot of people don't know is that most of the women were not from Piemonte. They were from the provinces of Ferrara and Ravenna in Romagna. And they traveled there to find work because Romagna, in many ways, was poorer than Emilia. So as we gently exit Bologna and we're going to head into Romagna, it's a whole other world than Emilia. We're still on the Via Emilia. And by the way, Bologna, oldest university in the world, fabulous restaurants, great opera house, 1768. It's the Italian city for me. We're not touching on it too much because I give my guarantee, and I think Lynne would too, that you'll love Bologna. One thing, you were mentioning the two towers, the Garisenda and the Asinelli. There is a superstition in Bologna that if you're a student at the university, you cannot climb the towers until you graduate. And if you do climb before, you will never graduate. So what these students do, we would get a hat from the Middle Ages, a long pointy hat.
Yes, yes.
Depending what we studied, it could be red or red for medicine, black, blue, and so on, white for the arts. And so I put on my long pointy hat. It has a gold fringe. And once you climb to the top of the tower, then you move the fringe to the other side and you have graduated. That's how officially you become a graduate of the University of Bologna.
Just like with the mortarboard.
Yes, exactly like a
Yeah,
mortar.
yeah. I like
So,
the idea of that particular way of doing it, though.
yeah.
It's better than the
So
other
when
way.
those towers are right in the middle of this fantastic market, which is not the only market, by the way, Bologna has others. It has
Yes, yes.
amazing ice cream. I learned all kinds of cooking. I mean, it's an amazing city. It's my favorite Italian city. But let's exit Bologna on the south side and head into Romagna. There are some hills there, such as the town of Dozza, D-O-Z-Z-A, where
Mhm.
the regional consortium of wine is. Most of the wine in the region is made more in Romagna than Emilia. It's made in Emilia, but more is made in Romagna. They make a lot of Trebbiano, it's a white. Albana is a white. And Lambrusco, which is mostly Modena, Reggio, Parma, is a slightly fizzy red wine that's much better than it's given credit for. And this slight prickle in the wine goes with the intense, fatty, salty, rich food. And it's a nice contrast. It will never be Bordeaux or Chianti or Brunello or
Mhm.
Monte's wines. But that's why Verdi, in his train to Russia, had French wine paired with his Parma food. Um, there are beautiful towns in Romagna. Ferrara is one of my favorites. It was a duchy. It was supremely cultured in the Renaissance. It was the town that was profoundly anti-fascist. It had a large Jewish population who were mostly removed during World War II. If you know the book and film The Garden of the Finzi Contini, that's set in Ferrara. There's a wonderful resistance museum about the Italian resistance in Ferrara. wonderful foods, pan pepato, which is a Renaissance dish, sort of a sweet bread in a way,
Mhm.
salama al sugo, which is a very delicate soft pork dish. And then we head to Ravenna, which was the capital, the Western capital of the Byzantine Empire. Amazing mosaics in the churches. Dante is buried in Ravenna. We're practically by the sea. We're near Cesena, where Marcello Hazan was from. Further north in that area is near the Po River is Comacchio. Comacchio is where eels are from, and eels are part of the tradition. And then we get to there's Faenza with the beautiful ceramics, mosaics, maiolica, and then we get to this Adriatic Sea. And when people think of the grand, meaty, cheesy, beefy foods of Emilia Romagna, they forget that this region has what's called the Romagnolo Riviera, which is this vast expanse of beaches where all of Northern Europe would come in the summer to go to the beach. And there's a whole sex scene going on there of young, handsome men from Romagna and pursuing German and Swedish women who marry them and stay. And it's a whole other world, basically.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
this was farmland and fishing land, and it was very poor. And then all the farmers sold off their land. One of the people who had land there, who was a peasant, was the father of Federico Fellini. And I don't
Oh,
know if you knew, Fellini was born in Rimini. His father was a pasta maker, a male, a sfogliino,
oh
and a
my.
bread baker. And he made pasticcine, which are sweet desserts. And when he sold that off, he continued to bake. He went to Rome and he learned Roman specialties. Um, and then he came back and raised Federico with his wife in Rimini. And Rimini, it's belittled a bit, but it's a very culturally rich city. The Malatesta family was from there. And to me, Federico Fellini stands with Michelangelo and with Verdi as the towering artist. And when he died in 1993, he got a state funeral in Rome that very few people recorded. And he won more Oscars than any director in terms for his films. The film I watched last night was La Strada, which was
Oh,
so
that's a hard
beautiful.
one.
It
That's a
was
hard one.
recently restored by Martin Scorsese to its full beauty and sound. And it's just a masterpiece. And Fellini was in his early 30s when he made it. He went on to make many other great films, some with his wife, Giulietta Massina, who starred in that. She was from the province of Bologna. And although we think of Fellini for Rome with La Dolce Vita and so on, I also think of him for Rimini and the Grand Hotel in the film Amarcord and so on. Lynn, you have spent a fair amount of time in Romagna, of course. We focused more on the products of Emilia because they're so famous, but talk about Romagna and what makes it special, because I love it.
Oh, I think first of all, it is a very different place. I think the essence of what Romagna is it. This is hard to say. In a strange way, it's closer to the earth. This has never been known the wealth of Emilia. The noble families of Romagna, I don't think very many of them reach the level of power. When you mentioned Ferrara, now Ferrara is part of Romagna. Now the family, the ducal family, was the Este,
Mhm.
and I spent a lot of time studying them. And one of the great books that has come out of the Renaissance on food is about the court there. There's a couple of books on it, but you usually did not have the level of wealth, and you did not have the same level of exchange going on, because you look at Emilia, Modena was a crossroads between the East and West. And I mean between Venice and the eastern coast. I'm sorry, I've got my coast. The west
The
coast of Italy.
Tyrrhenian Sea and the Adriatic Sea.
Thank you. This helps
Yeah.
so much. I can't tell you. But you look at Romania, and Romania is a place of farms, and it's a place, it was a great fruit growing area. And the other thing about it is, now this sounds strange, but I found with the people I met who were wonderfully kind, there's a certain sense of intimacy. And have you ever run across the work of Gianni Quando Matteo?
Sure.
Yeah, well, his writings, Gianni Quando Matteo was a journalist who was looking at his people and realizing that Romania was not looked upon as being terribly important. And he put together the first dictionary of the Romagnolo dialect. He then began doing studies of the foodways and the work of the fishermen. He did a book on nothing but the way different areas built their boats differently and for which reasons. Um, I, a very touching moment for me. I found his books when I was in, I think, Ravenna. And I learned something very quickly. When you're in a region, and this is probably true in many parts of the world, and you see a book that is about that place, never think, oh, I'll pick it up down the road. Buy
Grab
it,
it.
because the
Grab it.
local, the level of, it may be an elaborate book, looks like a book that you'll get all over Italy. No, no, no. Buy it, because, and I learned that very quickly. And so but I bought that book before I knew that. And I got more and more interested, and I kept running across his work. And finally, I tried to reach him. I wrote a letter, and I said, I'm going to be in Italy, and it would be, a great honor to meet you, because this man held in his head and in his imagination and in his research all of this knowledge about this area that you just don't read a great deal about.
No.
And I got a letter back from his son, who said, my father's been very ill, but he would really be honored if you would come and see us. And they were in a very small town in the hills. Kara, our friend, was with me. Well, his father had had a stroke and he couldn't speak. But the whole family had gathered. He was there in a wheelchair. And we all kind of worked together. They were so welcoming. And as I was leaving, he gestured to his son, and his son brought out every one of his books.
Ah.
So I have this wonderful library, and that's when I learned about the stories of Gramigna. No,
Wonderful pasta. It's a
yeah,
pasta often served with salsiccia, with sausage.
that's right.
Yeah,
But the thing
gramigna.
about that pasta is it speaks to the land, because fruit was a major industry for Romagna. But when the areas where the land had a lot of clay and you couldn't grow fruit, they'd grow hemp. And almost every farm woman had a large loom in her home, and she would be weaving the hemp to make ropes, etc. And a lot of people don't know this, but do you know you can use hemp to make some of the finest linen imaginable? Beautiful things.
Mhm.
A lot of the research I did was in what in Italy are called the ethnographic museums. It's the local town museum. And this is where people would say to me after we'd talked and they had been shown around, it would be the retired farmer or the school teacher. They'd say, you have to go and meet so-and-so because they do this, or their father was that. And what happened was, I learned that there was this pasta that is rolled around a dowel. It's cut in a square, and then it's put cattywampers. And so it's rolled around the dowel, and then that's rolled over a loom comb. And this is what these weavers would make for Sunday dinner. And it was called the pasta that made slaves of women, because this is a tiny little pasta, and you would have to make enough for bowls and bowls for a large family.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful, I think it's in Vertinoro. Vertinoro is a town that sits up on a high cliff just as you go up into the mountains. And it's very elegant. The area that faces out on the plain is very elegant. You go behind much simpler buildings, much simpler, lower income, families, but great history. But there's a beautiful column in the center of the town square, and it has many rings on it. And if you arrive there and you tie your horse up to one of those rings, someone is duty bound in the town to take you in as a guest, to
Ah,
feed, to protect you, to make sure you get a good night's sleep. And it's referred to as the hospitality column. Now,
ah.
I have to say, I hung out around that column for an entire day. And people were very nice, but nobody, got the hint. But I'd say about the plane, it's another world. And the Camacchio is the swamp. It goes back to pre-Roman times. In fact, they Etruscan, there have been some discoveries of Etruscan ruins there, and perhaps some sort of trade with the Eastern Mediterranean. But the mystery of it and the light is, how do I explain this? There are buildings on sticks that the eels, there's a whole system that the Romans set up and it hasn't changed. The materials have changed and that's it, to trap eels. And this used to supply most of the eels for much of the world.
Yeah.
This was a tremendous center. And they've now made it into a museum. And you go out there, especially on a foggy day or a gray day, and there's boardwalks going out into the Adriatic, and on stilts are these buildings. And this is where the nets would be brought in and the fish would start the process of being canned down the line. And you look out over this, and all the buildings are floating in clouds. They're not touching anything because you can't tell where the water ends and the sky begins. It's an evocative, beautiful area. But I can't quite nail down Romagna for all the years I've spent there. I remember the Sangiovese wine comes from there. And there's a great saying that people who were very kind to me there, and they said, will you come back? I remember the first time I went, and I said, of course. And they said, well, we've served you this red wine. And there's a saying that once you've drunk this wine, it leaves a stain on your throat and you will
Yeah.
always return.
Yeah.
But
Um,
it's a place it's evocative, those mosaics. I can't quite put it into words, but it's a place I loved going back to.
One thing that we didn't mention, I think because it's from the past now, is Emilia-Romagna used to have the most dense fogs I'd seen anywhere. And in fall and winter, it would be so foggy that you couldn't drive, you couldn't see in front of you. You would stick out your hand in Bologna or Parma and you couldn't see your hand.
Oh,
And Fellini in his films, but especially Amarcord, evoke these fogs so well. If you see Amarcord, you see people wandering in a fog, and that for him
yeah.
was sort of a metaphor for how they lived in sort of very immediately and defenselessly. And he was not the most political artist, but he understood that Mussolini was from Predappio, which is in Romagna,
Yeah.
and grew up. Fellini grew up under fascism. He was born in 1920, and so for that reason, his symbolism, he had a lot of symbols, was fog for that kind of stupidity, blindness, whatever. These miraculous things would appear from the sea, an enormous dead fish or a ship sailing. All
Mhm.
in Fellini. I'm regretful about Fellini because he was born in 1920, and this year being the centennial, I was supposed to teach a lot about Fellini in a lot of places with showings of his films, his impact on opera, and so on. But the pandemic took care of that, unfortunately. So maybe in the future. But I knew Fellini and his wife, Giulietta
Yeah.
Messina. And years ago, I taught a course at the New School in New York about Fellini. And this was before we had Zoom or anything. And we would have a weekly phone call from Rome, not with him, but with Messina, with Marcello Mastroianni, with the great composer Nino Rota, whose music I put on our listeners list. And we would talk to them about working with Fellini and the Fellini experience. He is a bit forgotten now, strangely. And they talk about Fellini-esque, and it's a stereotype of large women and extravagant men and crazy people. he was as much a humanist, as much a globalist, as much a sensualist as Verdi, as Rossini, and all of these great figures from Pavarotti, Freni, all of them from Emilia Romagna. And Lynne, all good things must come, if not to an end, then to the end of this. I could not have Emilia Romagna as my girlfriend, so I'm adopting you as my girlfriend. Much, much better than I
I have
think. Yeah.
I'm just sorry. I have to say one thing, by the way. I also sent my book proposal to an editor who asked, was I Emilia Romagna? So, yes, I don't know if it was
That
the same person.
brings us really full circle, except we hadn't met each other yet. So it was just, it was a blissful coincidence.
Yes.
Lynne, thank you. I'm glad that so many of my musical listeners have gotten to know you. Part of my intention today was to really explore the connections between food and music. There are so many, and food has inspired these great artists. Musicians have inspired chefs. It really all goes together. It's about the senses, and no place that I know of in the world, and there are many, compares to Emilia Romagna in terms of activating the senses. So thank you for this journey. Lynne and I, the last time we saw each other, had cheeseburgers and milkshakes in Minnesota. But maybe
I,
next time we'll make some pasta.
Fred, thank you. It has been a
Thank you.
tremendous pleasure.
Okay, see you soon.